Summer, 1943. The Atlantic was a graveyard of steel. Convoys stretched from New York to Algiers, and through that gauntlet of U-boats sailed ships unlike any other, not carrying bombs or tanks, but men who had once fired them. On the deck of a Liberty transport, Gefreiter Karl Weber, aged 22, gripped the rusted railing and stared at the endless blue. He had fought with Rommel's Afrika Korps in Tunisia, long enough to see the desert burn, the tanks melt, and the German war machine crack beneath the American advance. Now, he was a prisoner. Below decks, hundreds of captured Germans sat shoulder to shoulder, silent in the sweltering heat. The air smelled of diesel, salt, and fear. They didn't know where they were going, only that the journey had taken weeks. Rumors had filled the holds. "We're going to camps in Siberia," some whispered. Others claimed the Americans would line them up for execution upon arrival. One officer swore he had seen U.S. propaganda posters showing German POWs chained and whipped in open cages. The Allied guards said little. They handed out cigarettes, cans of rations marked U.S. Army, and water that tasted faintly of rust. To the prisoners, even the silence felt dangerous. The ocean was their last familiar thing, vast, merciless, and indifferent. When land finally appeared, Weber expected gray ports and barbed wire. What rose on the horizon instead was sunlight and cattle fields. The ship anchored near Galveston, Texas. The men were told to disembark, hands above their heads. As they stepped onto the dock, the heat struck like a hammer. It was not the Mediterranean warmth they knew, but a humid, heavy air that clung to the skin. One prisoner muttered, "The Americans want us to suffocate." Another said quietly, "Maybe this is hell." They were marched to a waiting train. Long, silver, airless cars with wooden benches and armed guards at both ends. The convoy rolled north through an endless horizon of plains and pastures. To men raised among forests and villages, the scale of Texas was unreal. A world without walls, stretching farther than imagination. Through the barred windows, they saw farmers working in wide fields, windmills spinning in the distance, children waving at the passing train. A few guards laughed softly. "They're waving at you, boys," one said. "They think you're circus folk." The Germans looked away, ashamed. Every stop brought more confusion. There were no jeering crowds, no soldiers with dogs, only curious townspeople, watching in silence. When they finally reached Camp Hearn, the prisoners braced for cruelty. They found instead organization, rows of wooden barracks surrounded by fences, a watchtower, a flagpole, and beyond it all, open land. The gates swung open. A U.S. sergeant shouted in German, "Keep your heads up! No one's going to hurt you here!" Weber's mind refused to believe it. This had to be a trick, some test before punishment began. They were ordered into formation, counted, searched. The guards confiscated knives, watches, even photos, but returned cigarettes. One soldier smirked and said in broken English, "You're not in Africa anymore, Hans." Inside the camp, the prisoners discovered things they hadn't seen in months. Clean bunks, running water, latrines, even a small mess hall with long wooden tables. It looked less like a prison and more like a construction site waiting for workers. After roll call, they were given instructions through a translator. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will work. You will be paid. You will not be harmed unless you attempt escape." The men exchanged glances. Paid? Geneva Convention? No one back home had ever mentioned that. Weber thought of the propaganda speeches he'd heard in Africa, how Americans were mongrel, cowards, how their prisoners were starved, beaten, or paraded for cameras. Yet here, the guards were passing out soap, blankets, and toothbrushes with the same efficiency as issuing ammunition. That night, the camp was silent except for the hum of insects and the distant mooing of cattle. The prisoners waited for the chains. None came. Weber couldn't sleep. He pressed his hand against the thin screen window, feeling the warm Texas wind. In the barracks, a corporal whispered, "Do you think the guards forgot to lock the doors?" Someone answered, "No. They know we have nowhere to run." The next morning confirmed it. No manacles, no barbed wire patrols inside the camp. The gates remained guarded, but life seemed free, too free. At breakfast, they were served oatmeal, eggs, and black coffee. It was hot, strong, and bitter. But to men who'd lived on hard biscuits and dust, it tasted like civilization. Later that day, American officers announced the work assignments. The prisoners would be sent to nearby farms and ranches under civilian supervision. They would pick cotton, repair fences, harvest grain. The reaction was disbelief. They had expected punishment, not employment. To fight was to die with honor. To farm for the enemy was unthinkable. But hunger and exhaustion have their own logic. Weber was assigned to a ranch near Brenham, Texas, alongside 7 other prisoners. They were escorted by a young Army corporal named Tom Bennett, who looked barely older than Weber himself. On the truck ride out, Bennett removed his helmet, wiped sweat from his brow, and said simply, "Don't try anything stupid. You'll be fine." Hours later, the truck stopped at the edge of a vast pasture dotted with cattle and mesquite trees. A windmill creaked in the distance. The rancher, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, greeted them with a nod. "You boys work hard. You'll eat good," he said. "No nonsense, and we'll get along just fine." It was the first sentence of mercy Weber had heard in years. The rancher handed them gloves, tools, and canteens. Then he pointed toward the open field and said, "Start with the fence line." The work was brutal under the Texas sun, but something strange happened as the day went on. No shouts, no slaps, no insults. At midday, the rancher's wife brought lemonade. For a moment, Weber forgot he was a prisoner. That night, he lay in the bunkhouse, muscles aching, eyes fixed on the wooden ceiling. The air smelled of hay and sweat, not fear. Somewhere outside, the crickets sang in the dark. He whispered to the man in the next cot, "They didn't chain us." The other replied, "Maybe they don't need to." Weber closed his eyes, realizing for the first time that captivity might not mean cruelty, and that the strangest thing about America was not its size, but its mercy. For most German soldiers, the voyage to America was their longest, strangest march. They had begun it not with fanfare, but surrender, under desert suns, on ruined beaches, and in bomb-blasted cities where defeat tasted of sand and smoke. In Tunisia, Sicily, and Normandy, entire divisions of the Wehrmacht and Afrika Korps had laid down their weapons before the advancing Allies. Captured, disarmed, and catalogued by number instead of rank, they became cargo in the machinery of victory. When the first ships left Oran and Liverpool carrying German prisoners westward, few aboard knew where the horizon would end. Some believed they were bound for Canada. Others whispered of secret American mines or frozen camps in Alaska. The ocean itself seemed to mock them. The same Atlantic their U-boats had once ruled now swallowed them in silence. Below deck, rumors became currency. They traded stories the way soldiers once traded rations. The Americans beat prisoners to death in their factories. They tattoo numbers on captives like cattle. They send you to Harlem, a city of criminals. Each tale was darker than the last, and all were false, but no one could prove it. They had been taught since childhood that the enemy was monstrous. Nazi propaganda films had shown caricatures of Americans, cigar-chewing gangsters, fat industrialists, and jazz-playing degenerates who knew nothing of discipline or honor. To fall into their hands, the soldiers were told, was to forfeit dignity or life. On the third week at sea, the monotony broke when a storm hit. Rain hammered the deck, and salt water leaked through the ventilation ducts. Guards helped bail out the compartments, shouting over the roar. When one prisoner slipped and broke his wrist, a medic, barely 20, bandaged it without a word. The act was so ordinary, so human, that it unsettled everyone who saw it. If this was the enemy, why did he care? For men like Karl Weber, the questions grew heavier than the chains they never wore. Days blurred into a pattern of tin plates, lifeboat drills, and distant engines. Then, one morning, sunlight spilled across the steel decks, and the cry went up. Land. America. They crowded the railings, expecting factories and searchlights. Instead, they saw coastline. Flat, endless, green. The Gulf shimmered under a pale sky. Fishing boats dotted the water. Seabirds wheeled overhead. No fortresses, no guns, only the ghost of salt and the scent of pine. For the first time since capture, many prisoners felt curiosity nibble at their fear. As the Liberty ship glided toward Galveston Harbor, a band on the pier began playing. The tune was faint but recognizable. Stars and Stripes Forever. To German ears, it sounded absurdly cheerful, like a circus greeting an invasion. Some laughed, others turned away in shame. Disembarkation was methodical. American MPs lined the pier, rifles slung, uniforms spotless. They were young, so young that Weber wondered if they had ever seen combat. A few smiled awkwardly, as if unsure how to look at defeated men. The prisoners were counted, photographed, and tagged with numbered wristbands. Then came an order none expected. Remove your belts. Keep your shoes. You will need them where you're going. The distinction felt important. In the Reich, captured enemies were stripped to humiliation. Here, even prisoners kept their footwear. A small mercy that said more than speeches. The train that awaited them was unlike any military transport they had known. Clean cars, open windows, fans turning slowly overhead. Civilians waved from station platforms as the convoy rolled inland. Children ran alongside until the heat slowed them. The Americans guarding the train didn't bark commands. They handed out chewing gum. That detail spread through the cars like wildfire. Chewing gum, a soldier muttered, tasting it for the first time. It's sweet, like soap and sugar. A guard grinned. You'll get used to it. By nightfall, the endless prairie had replaced the sea. Horizon after horizon. Grass, cattle. The glow of small towns flickering in the distance. No one could imagine escape. There was nowhere to run. One sergeant pointed out the window. Texas, he said simply, bigger than all of Germany. The words settled like dust. For men who had marched across half of Europe, the size of this new world was incomprehensible. At a refueling stop, townspeople gathered to glimpse the prisoners. An old woman held a basket of peaches. When a guard hesitated, she insisted, "Give them these. It's too hot to be hungry." The fruit passed down the line. Soft, ripe, dripping juice. It was the first fresh thing most had tasted in months. No one spoke. The sweetness was almost painful. Later, as the train pulled away, one prisoner whispered, "If this is captivity, what does freedom look like?" Not all were ready to believe. A few diehards still swore that America's kindness was camouflage, that behind every smile was interrogation and revenge. They repeated the Reich's promises of rescue, that Germany would soon invade England, that the fatherland would rise again, that they would go home victorious. But the older men, those who had seen Stalingrad and El Alamein, knew better. They stared out at the setting sun and said nothing. When the train finally stopped, the guards ordered them to disembark. A sign on the siding read, "Camp Hearn, Texas." The ground shimmered with heat. Barbed wire glinted around the perimeter, but beyond it stretched pastures and the faint smell of hay. An American lieutenant addressed them through a translator. "You are prisoners of war, not slaves. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Follow the rules, and you will have no trouble." The words sounded rehearsed, but their meaning was revolutionary. For men who had seen their own army execute Soviet captives by the thousand, the promise of humane treatment was unimaginable. Inside the camp, reality and rumor collided. The barracks were plain but solid. Wooden floors, cots, screened windows, electric lights that worked. In the mess hall, the first meal waited. Beans, bread, and coffee. No speeches, no shouting, only the clatter of trays. Karl Weber sat down, stared at the food, and felt a strange mixture of gratitude and confusion. The coffee smelled strong, American, industrial, and it filled the air with warmth. When he took his first sip, the taste was bitter, alien, unforgettable. Around him, the others ate cautiously, as if the kindness might vanish if they enjoyed it too much. Some murmured prayers in German. Others simply stared at their plates. That night, when lights dimmed and the cicadas began their droning chorus, a single thought passed through the barracks. This was not what they had been told. No chains, no cruelty, only fences and a curious sense of calm. As Weber lay awake, listening to the Texas wind push through the wire, he realized that the war he had fought was ending in a place that felt nothing like war at all. And for the first time, he wondered whether the real battle was no longer between armies, but between ideas of what mercy could be. August 1943, Central Texas. The air shimmered with heat that seemed to rise straight from the earth itself. Dust clung to every boot, every sleeve, every breath. The war in Europe felt like another planet. Camp Hearn had settled into rhythm. Morning roll call, work assignments, meals, and the same haunting bugle at dusk. The fences stood tall but almost ornamental now, less a barrier than a reminder that somewhere beyond, the world still fought. Every morning, trucks lined up by the gate. Farmers from nearby ranches waited with lists in hand, authorized to hire POW labor under strict Army oversight. The logic was simple. The men who had burned Europe's fields would now help feed America's. Each truckload of prisoners left under guard, but the guards often sat in the shade with rifles slung casually over their shoulders. The prisoners noticed this and wondered what kind of enemy trusted his captives that much. Karl Weber's name was called again. He was assigned to the Gibson Ranch, 50 miles west, a sprawl of sun-baked pasture land dotted with mesquite and barbed wire fences that stretched beyond sight. When the truck arrived, the prisoners hesitated before stepping down. They were met not by soldiers, but by a man in denim overalls and a weathered hat. John Gibson had lost 2 nephews in North Africa. He had every reason to hate the men standing before him, yet his tone was quiet, even polite. "You boys work steady," he said, "and you'll be treated right." It wasn't a welcome, but it wasn't condemnation either. He pointed to the barn, the fields, the herds scattered under the midday sun. Then he gestured to the horizon, a line of hills shimmering with mirage. "That's your fence line. There's enough work to keep you busy until Christmas." The prisoners exchanged uncertain glances. Was this freedom or another trick? Still, they took the tools offered. Hammers, wire spools, gloves. The first few hours were brutal. The Texas sun punished any exposed skin. Dust got in their mouths, their eyes. Their thoughts, Weber's partner, Friedrich Meissner, muttered, "I'd rather fight the British again than this sun." Yet when they paused for water, Gibson's teenage son brought a galvanized bucket filled with ice. Ice, something no soldier had tasted since before Tunisia. The boy grinned shyly as they drank. "Hot day, huh?" he said in English that none of them understood, but somehow everyone felt. That night, the prisoners returned to camp too tired to speak. But something had changed. The guards hadn't shouted once. The rancher hadn't carried a gun. And when they'd finished the fence line, Gibson had clapped Weber on the shoulder and said, "Good work, son." The word son echoed long after. Within weeks, the work camps around Texas developed a quiet rhythm of their own. Prisoners repaired barns, picked cotton, built irrigation ditches, and harvested wheat. Each evening, they returned dusty, sunburned, and a little less afraid. At Camp Huron, a bulletin board began to fill with postcards. American towns requesting more laborers. Farmers, short on manpower since their sons had gone to war, wrote simple pleas. Send 10 Germans, experienced with machinery. Need hands for cotton harvest. Promise fair treatment. The army complied. As long as the men worked hard and followed rules, they were granted privileges unheard of in wartime prisons. Letters home, organized sports, even access to the camp library. Someone donated a record player, and soon the sound of swing music leaked from the recreation hall. At first, the prisoners mocked it, this frantic, jazzy chaos that broke every rule of order they'd been taught. But slowly, curiosity replaced scorn. They began tapping their feet. Then one evening, under a sky strung with fading stars, a small group formed their own orchestra from scavenged instruments. The mix was absurd: a German accordion, a broken guitar, 2 makeshift drums. Yet the music that came out was something neither army had ever trained for. Half waltz, half swing, and wholly human. Even the guards stopped to listen. By autumn, the camp fences had become symbolic. They stood, yes, but the gates were often open during work hours. No one ran. There was nowhere to go. One corporal joked, "If they escape, they'll just get lost and come back for dinner." He wasn't wrong. A few did wander off occasionally, disoriented by the vast Texas plains. When they stumbled into nearby farms, local sheriffs would call the camp commander. "Got one of your boys here," they'd say. "He's sunburned and hungry. Want us to send him back after supper?" And they did. The idea that prisoners could roam freely in the same land they once fought against baffled everyone, including the prisoners themselves. Weber wrote in his small notebook, "We are not chained because they do not need chains. The space itself is our prison. And somehow it feels larger than freedom." Life under American guards was strict but predictable. Inspections at dawn, head counts, curfews. But there were no beatings, no mock executions, none of the cruelty they had seen or inflicted in occupied Europe. The guards were often farm boys themselves, young, sunburned, and polite. One named Private Lee McCullough greeted them each morning with the same line, "Morning, fellas. Don't die of heat today." When Weber once struggled with a broken wagon axle, McCullough knelt beside him to help. Wordlessly, efficiently, like 2 mechanics instead of enemies. Later, Weber noted in his diary, "Americans respect work more than rank. Here, effort earns dignity, not uniform." That realization spread through the barracks like oxygen. Men who had once worn iron crosses now found pride in rebuilding fences, driving tractors and fixing machines. The war had taken away their power. But labor, oddly enough, returned a fragment of self-worth. By late 1943, the boundaries between captor and captive had blurred. Local ranchers began inviting work crews to share meals during harvests. Photographs from the time show German soldiers sitting beside American families at long outdoor tables, paper plates, sweet tea, laughter that transcended translation. Children played nearby, sometimes climbing onto the prisoners' laps to listen to stories about snow, mountains, and castles. One small girl asked Weber, "Do you have cows in Germany?" He smiled for the first time in months. "Yes," he said, pointing at the horizon. "But not so many skies." The army tolerated the friendliness. Barely. Official memos warned, "Do not fraternize excessively. Remember, they are enemy combatants." But on the ground, kindness was easier than hate. The farmers needed hands. The prisoners needed purpose. And between those needs, a fragile peace began to grow. One fence post, one handshake, one shared glass of water at a time. As winter cooled the plains, frost gathered on the barracks' roofs. Inside, the men wrapped themselves in wool blankets issued by the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. They read American newspapers, studied English phrases, and watched their guards throw snowballs like boys on holiday. The barbed wire glittered faintly in the morning light, not as a warning anymore, but as a memory of a war that, at least here in Texas, had already started to end. By early 1944, the war had moved farther away from Texas than anyone could imagine. Newspaper headlines spoke of Anzio, Casino, and the Eastern Front. But in the sun-baked plains of central Texas, a quieter front was being fought, not between armies, but between fear and understanding. The POW camp at Hearne no longer felt like an outpost of war. It had become a small, self-contained town. The men worked, studied, prayed, and even argued. Not about tactics anymore, but about what came next. The shock of survival had faded. Now came the stranger emotion: gratitude. At the Gibson Ranch, Carl Weber had become something of a fixture. What began as forced labor had slowly turned into routine, and, eventually, familiarity. He repaired engines, managed fences, and trained new arrivals in the rhythm of ranch work. The rancher, John Gibson, treated him like an extra pair of capable hands, not an enemy. One afternoon, after a long day repairing a windmill, Gibson waved him toward the porch. "Come eat," he said. Weber froze. Prisoners weren't supposed to sit with civilians. But Gibson insisted. They ate in silence: roast beef, cornbread, and sweet tea. The rancher's wife, Martha, placed an extra slice of pie in front of him. "Eat, son," she said, her tone motherly rather than political. Weber hesitated, then nodded. He remembered the meager rations in Africa, the hard biscuits, the oily water. Now, here he was, eating homemade pie under a wide American sky. He whispered, almost to himself, "This is not war anymore." That night, he returned to the barracks with something new in his chest. Not guilt, not pride, but a fragile warmth he couldn't name. The U.S. Army allowed prisoners to send 2 letters a month through the Red Cross. For many, it was the only lifeline home. Censors blacked out anything related to military affairs, but the words that survived were human. "I am alive. We are treated well. I work on a farm. They are kind." In one of his letters, Weber wrote, "Tell Mother not to worry. I fix fences for people who once called us enemies. They feed us. They call me Carl. It is strange to be free inside a fence." Weeks later, a reply arrived. Thin paper, trembling handwriting. "My son, if they feed you, then perhaps God still walks among men." He folded the letter carefully, tucked it in his pocket, and carried it every day thereafter. The Gibsons were churchgoers, the kind who never missed a Sunday, even in harvest season. Weber and the other POWs would watch them drive off each week, dressed in clean shirts and quiet conviction. One morning, the rancher paused beside the truck. "You boys want to come along?" he asked casually. The Germans looked at each other, unsure whether it was invitation or test. Weber nodded. "I think God speaks all languages," he said softly. At the small white church, the locals shifted uncomfortably when the prisoners walked in. The pastor cleared his throat before saying, "Today, we remember that mercy is not weakness." They sat in the back pew, heads bowed. The hymns were foreign, but the melody of faith was familiar. When the congregation sang Amazing Grace, Weber found himself humming along, not the words, but the feeling. After service, an elderly woman pressed a small Bible into his hand. "Keep this," she said, "for when you go home." It was the first gift he'd received since before the war. Evenings at the camp had changed too. Where once the sound of boots and roll calls dominated, now there was music. The prisoners had formed an orchestra, violins, accordions, and makeshift drums built from empty ration tins. They played German folk songs, then began learning American tunes. On Saturdays, guards and locals were invited to listen. The camp's recreation yard turned into an open-air concert hall. American soldiers leaned against trucks, tapping their boots. Farmers brought lemonade. For a few hours, the war disappeared. During one performance, Weber spotted Private McCullough, the young guard who had once helped him fix a wagon axle. He waved. McCullough grinned back and raised his Coca-Cola bottle in salute. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. A drink born of American capitalism, shared between enemies under the Texas stars. That summer, Gibson's son, Billy, turned 12. He followed the prisoners around the ranch, fascinated by their accents and stories. One day, he asked Weber what Germany looked like. Weber pulled a worn photograph from his pocket. A farmhouse near Bremen. A woman standing beside a bicycle. "My mother," he said. "And that's my sister. She's your age." Billy stared at it, then looked at Weber. "She looks kind," he said. Weber smiled. "She is. Maybe one day you'll meet her." Billy grinned. "Maybe one day you'll come back." It was a childish thought, but it stuck. That autumn, after the cotton harvest, the Gibsons held a small gathering to thank their workers. For the first time, prisoners and guards sat side by side with local families. The long table was covered in white cloth, heavy with cornbread, beans, roasted chicken, and pitchers of tea. Weber sat near the end, beside the rancher's wife. When grace was said, all bowed their heads, German and American alike. Afterward, laughter replaced fear. A photographer from a local paper captured the moment. "German POWs dine with local farmers." The headline was small, tucked between stories of battlefront victories and war bonds. But to those who were there, it was a victory of a different kind. Not every prisoner changed. Some remained bitter, clinging to the Reich's ghost. But others, like Weber, began to understand something the war had tried to erase: that humanity was not divided by uniform, but by choice. He wrote in his journal that winter, "We fought for pride. They fight for decency. Perhaps decency is the stronger weapon." The pages of that journal would later be found among Red Cross archives, a rare first-person account of transformation, written not from the ashes of cities, but from the soil of a Texas ranch. By Christmas, the work season ended. The prisoners returned to the main camp, awaiting reassignment. Before they left, John Gibson handed Weber a small package, a pair of worn work gloves, and a note that read, "For when you go home. The world will need rebuilding. Start with your own fences." Weber stood silently, unable to find words. Finally, he said, "I came here as your enemy. You let me leave as your student." The rancher nodded once. Then maybe the war taught something after all. That winter night, the POW truck rolled away under a cold Texas moon. Through the open slats, Weber looked back and saw the ranch house lights fading into the horizon. Somewhere inside, a family was finishing supper, just as his once had. 2 worlds apart, bound by a meal and a kind of mercy that no army manual could explain. By spring of 1944, the war had turned decisively against Germany. Rumors filtered slowly through Texas, from American guards, newspapers, and Red Cross bulletins pinned to the camp notice boards. Names like Normandy, St. Lo, and Cannes began to appear. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. The Reich was crumbling. Inside the barbed wire, the prisoners lived in a strange suspension. They were safe, fed, clothed, and even paid 30 cents a day for their labor. But safety came with guilt. Each meal, each laugh, each Texas sunset reminded them of what their families might be enduring thousands of miles away. Mail arrived twice a month. Each letter bore the red stamp of the censor, sometimes with entire sentences blacked out. Weber unfolded one in the shade of the mess hall. His mother's handwriting was weaker now. The town is different. Bombs fell nearby. The neighbors moved away. We pray for the end. Another line had been erased, a thick rectangle of ink where truth used to be. He stared at it for a long time. In that silence, he realized that war could erase words as easily as people. That night, he wrote back, "I am alive. The Americans treat us fairly. There is work, food, and even music. I think of the farm every day." He didn't mention the guilt, the quiet shame of comfort while Germany burned. Instead, he folded the paper carefully and handed it to the camp clerk. The act of mailing it felt like both a confession and a prayer. When the Normandy invasion was announced, the guards couldn't hide their excitement. A radio crackled in the recreation hall, and a crowd of prisoners gathered around it, listening to the English words they barely understood. Allied forces. Beaches, France. Some cheered quietly. Others clenched their fists. A small group of die-hard Nazis, still loyal to the Führer, called the rest traitors. They painted swastikas on barracks walls at night and whispered of secret vengeance. The camp commander, an American major named Harold Baines, knew about them. He watched closely, but intervened sparingly, understanding that ideology was now its own kind of prison. Weber avoided them. He had seen enough of fanaticism, in Africa, in the ruins of Italy, in the eyes of men who believed loyalty could outlive truth. Instead, he focused on work, on letters, and on the steady, quiet dignity of labor. That summer, Weber's friend Friedrich Meissner fell ill. What began as fever soon became something worse. A dull yellow pallor, a cough that rattled his ribs, nights drenched in sweat. The camp doctor, a middle-aged American named Dr. Samuel Hart, examined him gently. "Malaria," he said, "probably from North Africa. It's been hiding in his blood." He prescribed quinine, but the supply was low. Hart sat by the bed most nights, checking Meissner's pulse with quiet patience. The doctor spoke little German, but kindness needed no translation. Weber stayed beside his friend, fanning him with an old newspaper. Meissner tried to joke. "Maybe this is my way home," he whispered, weakly smiling. Weber shook his head. "No, you'll see Bremen again. You'll fix tractors and curse the rain like before." But both men knew the lie. On the third night, Meissner asked for a cigarette. Weber lit it and held it between his fingers while Meissner inhaled faintly. "Tell my mother," he murmured. "Tell her I remembered the smell of wheat." He died before dawn. When the news spread through the camp, silence followed. Even the guards seemed subdued. Dr. Hart arranged for a burial within the compound, a small wooden cross, hand-cut from a crate, with Meissner's name carved carefully into it. At noon, the prisoners gathered. They stood in formation, uniforms faded, boots dusty from labor. The American guards lined the opposite side of the clearing. Then, something unexpected happened. Major Baines gave an order. "Present arms." The Americans raised their rifles in salute, a gesture reserved for their own fallen. The bugle played taps. Its slow, haunting notes drifted over the wire, over the fields, into the blue Texas sky. Many prisoners wept openly. Weber could not move. He stared at the flagpole. Not at the flag, but at the man who ordered it, lowered halfway. For a single moment, there were no sides, no uniforms, no enemies, only men, bound by the same silence that death demands. Later that night, Weber sat alone, staring at Meissner's empty bunk. He wrote in his journal, "They saluted him. They honored him. We were taught they had no soul. But today, they proved us wrong." The salute spread like rumor through every camp in Texas. German prisoners began treating their captors with a new kind of respect. Not fear, not obedience, but recognition. Even the most stubborn nationalists found their certainty eroding. Some requested English books. Others began attending classes held by American teachers. History, mathematics, even agriculture. They were told it would help them rebuild Germany after the war. To most, it sounded impossible. But to a few, it sounded like hope. The army encouraged it. Colonel Baines issued a quiet memo. "These men may one day lead the peace. The way we treat them now will shape what kind of peace that is." Weber copied the line into his notebook. It stayed with him for decades. By December 1944, the Allied advance had crossed into Germany itself. The POWs in Texas followed every inch of it through maps pinned to the mess hall wall. Each red arrow pushed closer to the Rhine. Each headline tore another thread of their old world apart. One morning, the camp radio announced that Hitler's forces had launched a desperate counterattack, the Ardennes offensive. Weber's heart sank. He imagined his hometown caught in the crossfire, his family cowering in cellars. And then, silence again. No more letters came after January. The postal system had collapsed. For many, the last words from home would remain the last forever. That winter was the coldest Texas had seen in years. The men wore donated coats from the Red Cross. Inside the barracks, stoves glowed red against the wind. They celebrated Christmas quietly. The Americans allowed them to decorate a small tree in the yard, made from scrap wood, its branches painted green. Someone played Silent Night on an accordion. Outside the fence, ranchers gathered, listening from their trucks. When the final notes faded, Major Baines stepped forward. "You may not believe me," he said, "but I hope you all see home again soon." Weber looked around at the faces, weary, changed, no longer soldiers but men suspended between two worlds. Home was no longer a place. It was a possibility, and for the first time, he began to think that captivity might have freed something inside them that war never could. May 1945. The war that had reshaped the earth was finally over. News reached Texas in the stillness of morning. Shouted across mess halls, printed in black ink, sung from radios like hymns. Germany surrenders. For a moment, no one in the camps spoke. Then came confusion, then disbelief, then silence again. The Americans cheered, hugged, and waved newspapers in the air. But behind the wire, the German prisoners simply stood still. Some smiled faintly. Others dropped to their knees, whispering prayers for cities that no longer existed. To be told the war was over, for men who had been away from home for 3 years, was both a promise and a wound. What waited for them beyond those fences was not victory, not even home, but ruins. The next morning, Camp Hearn held its final roll call. American officers stood alongside German non-coms who had long since stopped pretending to hold authority. Each name echoed into the hot air, a roll of ghosts. When Karl Weber's name was called, he raised his hand automatically. He realized, with a start, that he no longer thought of himself as a prisoner, nor as a soldier, just a man standing in the Texas sun, alive. The reaction among the guards was complex. Some were jubilant, others strangely quiet. Private McCullough, the same young guard who once shared chewing gum and laughter, told Weber, "Well, I guess you boys won't need me watching over you much longer." Weber nodded. "No, but I will miss it." The guard laughed softly. "That's the strangest thing I've heard all week." In truth, many of the Americans had grown fond of the men they'd once been trained to fear. They knew their names, their stories, even their favorite foods. Some had learned enough German to trade jokes. Now they would load them onto trains again, not to battlefields, but to a homeland they no longer recognized. A convoy of trucks rolled up one morning under a pale blue sky. Each carried crates of belongings, blankets, letters, carved souvenirs, and small gifts given by local families. The ranchers had come too, standing quietly by the gate. John Gibson was there, hat in hand, waiting for the men who had worked his land. When Weber stepped forward, the rancher extended his hand without hesitation. "You fixed my fences," he said simply. "And my faith, I think." Weber took his hand. "You gave me back my name." Neither man could say more. Nearby, Martha Gibson handed out small cloth bundles, biscuits, tobacco, and one last note folded inside each. "May peace find you before pride does." A few of the prisoners wept openly. So did more than one guard. The train heading north toward the repatriation center at Camp Shanks, New York, was nothing like the one that had brought them here. Then, the cars had been filled with fear, silence, and rumor. Now they were filled with quiet reflection. Men looked out at the vast country rolling by, fields, rivers, towns untouched by war, and tried to memorize what peace looked like. Some sang softly, old folk songs from home. Others wrote in journals, trying to capture what words could never quite hold. Weber jotted a single line: "The Americans defeated us with mercy." At one stop, a group of local townspeople stood by the tracks, waving small flags. A young girl handed up a basket of fruit. "Good luck," she called. The men waved back, unsure whether to smile or cry. At the port, they were processed for return. Deloused, documented, medically cleared. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same Statue of Liberty that had greeted immigrants decades before now watched over their departure. Chotu. U.S. Army medical officers shook hands with many of them before they boarded the ships. "Good luck rebuilding," one said. "You've got work to do." It was the kind of farewell only a former enemy could make. The journey back across the Atlantic mirrored the one that had brought them. But everything felt reversed. There was no fear this time, only uncertainty. The ocean seemed calmer, the sky wider. Seagulls followed the convoy, as if escorting them back to history. Men stood along the rails, staring eastward. They imagined what waited beyond the gray horizon: bombed-out cities, broken bridges, and family graves. Some spoke of staying in America. Others vowed to rebuild what they could. One prisoner, an older teacher from Hamburg, said quietly, "Perhaps we were never meant to win, only to learn." The men nodded. No one argued. They docked at Bremerhaven in the cold rain of October 1946. The harbor was unrecognizable. Cranes twisted like skeletons, warehouses flattened by bombs. The air smelled of salt and smoke and hunger. Weber stepped onto the gangway, clutching the small Bible Martha Gibson had given him. He looked around at the landscape of defeat and thought of the wide Texas sky. There had been fences there too, but they had felt open. Here, everything felt closed. As he walked toward the registration tent, he passed a line of children begging for food. He stopped, reached into his pocket, and handed a piece of hard candy, his last from America, to a little boy in tattered shoes. The boy smiled. For a moment, Weber saw his own reflection. Younger, frightened, still human. His mother's house was gone. In its place stood rubble and a half-collapsed wall. A neighbor told him she had died in an air raid the year before. He sat in the rain for a long time, holding the Bible, the gloves Gibson had given him, and the letter that had survived the crossing. On the inside cover he wrote, "I went to war to fight for a nation. I returned to learn what it means to belong to humanity." Months later, Weber found work as a mechanic in Bremen. He married, raised 2 children, and never spoke of the war except to say, "I was fed by those I was taught to hate." In the 1960s, He returned to America, to Texas. He found the Gibson Ranch still standing, the same windmills still turning in the hot wind. John Gibson had passed away, but his son Billy was there, a grown man now, running the ranch with his own family. When Weber introduced himself, Billy froze, then smiled. "My father used to talk about you," he said. Said you were the best fence man he ever had. They shook hands. And just like that, the distance of 2 decades collapsed into a memory shared by 2 men, one Texan, one German, who had once lived on opposite sides of the same wire. In the years that followed, historians would describe America's POW program as the most humane captivity in modern warfare. Over $425,000 German prisoners were held across the United States, many in Texas, and fewer than 2% attempted escape. Not because they couldn't, but because they didn't want to. For them, captivity had become education. They had seen decency stronger than doctrine, mercy stronger than steel. Karl Weber would later write in his memoir, "The war ended the day I was handed a glass of water by a man who should have hated me. It was not defeat that broke me. It was kindness that rebuilt me. History remembers battles and treaties, but sometimes the greatest victories happen quietly, over shared meals, over open hands, over fences that no longer divide." The German POWs came to Texas expecting chains. Instead, they found a nation that believed mercy could win a war's final peace. The war was over, but its lessons were only beginning to take root. The barbed wire that once divided men had been rolled up, sold for scrap, and forgotten by most. But for those who had lived behind it, and those who had watched from the other side, something enduring had been planted in that Texas soil. The story of the German POWs didn't end when they boarded ships home. It lingered, in letters exchanged across oceans, in memories passed quietly through families, and in the ways both nations redefined what it meant to be civilized after barbarity. The American government had never set out to create a moral experiment, but in hindsight, that's exactly what it became. Over 425,000 German POWs were held across the United States, and nearly half of them passed through camps in the South and Southwest, Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. They worked the fields, repaired railroads, built silos, and mended fences, and through that work, both sides were transformed. Reports from the War Department in 1947 called the program a success in morale rehabilitation. The prisoners who returned to Germany did not bring back bitterness. They brought back perspective. Many later became teachers, engineers, and even city officials in post-war Germany, advocating for democratic reform. They had seen a different kind of authority. Not imposed through fear, but balanced through fairness. Historians would later note that the U.S. treatment of POWs helped lay an invisible foundation for West Germany's peaceful reconstruction. Proof that mercy, not punishment, could rebuild a broken nation. For Americans, too, the camps had left a mark. The farmers and guards who had once feared these Nazis now saw something familiar in their humanity. Fathers, sons, craftsmen, musicians, newspaper editorials in Texas, Alabama, and Georgia began to shift tone. One 1946 headline read, "They came as prisoners. They leave as men we will remember." A rancher's wife in Huntsville wrote to her local paper, "We learned that kindness is not weakness. These boys worked our land, built our barns, and prayed in our churches. If this is what victory looks like, it is one we can live with." It was a sentiment echoed across rural America, a quiet pride in having shown decency when cruelty would have been easier. In 1945, as part of the War Department's Special Projects Division, selected POWs attended re-education classes. But unlike the forced indoctrination they had known under the Reich, these lessons were voluntary. Lectures on democracy, ethics, and world history. At first, attendance was sparse, but curiosity proved stronger than ideology. Soon, the camp auditoriums were full. American instructors screened films about the U.S. Constitution, civic duty, and freedom of speech. They allowed open debate, something banned in Germany for over a decade. One instructor later recalled, "When I told them in America, a man could criticize the president and still keep his job, they thought I was joking." The prisoners laughed at first. Then they began asking questions, serious ones, and the seed of a different kind of loyalty began to grow, not to a flag, but to fairness itself. By the early 1950s, letters began arriving in Texas from post-war Germany. Many were written in broken English, but the meaning was clear. They were thank you notes from former prisoners to the families who had once fed and employed them. One read, "Dear Mr. Gibson, I hope your ranch is well. I still wear the gloves you gave me. My son now helps on our small farm, and I tell him how Americans fixed fences and hearts at the same time." Others enclosed photographs of new homes, of children born in peace, of families rebuilt from ashes. In one remarkable case, a former POW sent the Gibsons a bag of German soil, labeled simply, "From my land to yours. We are not enemies anymore." Those letters were tucked into drawers, pinned to walls, and passed down for generations, proof that small acts of mercy had outlasted the war itself. The presence of German prisoners also taught America something about itself. For many small towns, the camps were the first-time residents, had come face to face with the enemy. They discovered that evil was not a nationality, and that ordinary people could be caught in extraordinary lies. It changed how many Americans thought about justice. When the Nuremberg trials began, Texans who had hosted POWs followed the headlines differently. They could now imagine the human faces behind those uniforms, and distinguish between those who gave orders and those who obeyed them out of fear. That empathy didn't excuse crimes, but it made forgiveness a conversation instead of a wound. By 1950, West Germany's democratic rebirth was in full motion. Many historians credit that transformation not just to Marshall Plan aid or political reform, but to the POWs who had experienced America firsthand. They returned speaking of liberty not as an abstraction, but as something they had seen lived out by people who once called them enemies. One former POW, Hans Richter, who spent 2 years in a Texas camp, became a teacher in Hamburg. He told his students, "We learned democracy not from textbooks, but from the way the Americans treated our dead." Another, a carpenter named Otto Müller, rebuilt a bombed school in his hometown, using blueprints modeled on the barracks he'd lived in at Camp Hearn. When asked why, he said, "Because it was sturdy, and because we built it together." Even in Texas, the physical traces of the POW era remained long after the camps closed. Concrete foundations lay buried beneath new roads. Old watchtowers were repurposed as barns. In Hearn, locals still call the site the Old German Camp. Every spring, wildflowers bloom where barbed wire once glinted under the sun. A small museum now stands there, quiet, respectful, filled with black and white photos of young faces that look both foreign and familiar. Among them, a grainy picture shows Carl Weber standing beside John Gibson and his son, 3 men smiling at a fence they had just repaired together. The caption reads, "Work completed. 1944. Friendship begun forever." Decades later, historians would debate whether the POW experience was driven by morality or mere practicality. But the answer, as always, lies in the faces. The ranchers who chose to see men instead of monsters, and the prisoners who chose to respond with integrity instead of hatred. Dr. Samuel Hart, the camp doctor who once tended to sick POWs, wrote in his retirement letter, "We won the war with weapons, But we kept the peace with kindness, and I think, in the end, that's the greater victory. By the time Karl Weber was an old man, his memories had blurred into sepia tones, the smell of hay, the taste of Texas dust, the warmth of pie served by a stranger. When he spoke to his grandchildren, he didn't talk about battles or guns. He told them about fences, farms, and people who gave their enemies water before asking for their surrender. In his final note, discovered after his death in 1991, he wrote, "The world doesn't remember every soldier, but I hope it remembers every act of mercy. Because mercy is what wins wars, not for nations, but for humanity." Summer 1965. 20 years had passed since the last convoy of German prisoners left the Texas plains. The camp was gone, its fences dismantled, its barracks either burned or folded into new barns. But memories, unlike wire, don't rust so easily. They linger in soil, in letters tucked into drawers, in the faint echo of a bugle no one had blown in decades. That year, a small group of former POWs returned to America as part of a Red Cross-sponsored peace delegation. Among them was Karl Weber, now 53, gray-haired, soft-spoken, still carrying the quiet of a man who once waited behind fences that had set him free. As the jet descended over the Gulf Coast, Weber pressed his forehead to the window. Below him spread the same endless Texas horizon. Flat, gold, shimmering in the heat. It looked unchanged, as if time itself had respected the landscape's dignity. But this time there were no guards, no roll calls, no fear, only anticipation. He carried with him two things: the Bible Martha Gibson had given him in 1944, and a letter addressed simply to the family at the ranch near Hearn. He didn't know whether they still lived there. He just needed to try. The bus dropped the small delegation at the edge of town. Hearn had grown. New stores, paved streets, neon signs where once had been wooden porches. Yet when the locals heard that the Germans had come back, word spread like summer lightning. Some of the same farmers arrived, older now, their faces creased, but eyes the same. They shook hands awkwardly at first, then with genuine warmth. Laughter bridged the years. Someone produced lemonade. Someone else said, "You remember that fence you boys built?" Still standing. The next day, Weber borrowed a truck and followed the dirt road he remembered. Dust rose behind him like memory made visible. When he reached the Gibson property, the same windmill still turned slowly above the field. A man stepped out of the barn, broad-shouldered, sun-tanned, with a familiar set to his jaw. Billy Gibson, now in his 30s. Weber called out, voice trembling, "You must be Billy." The man turned, stunned. Then he broke into a smile that looked like sunlight finding its way through years. "I knew you'd come back someday," he said. They walked the fence line together, the one Karl had repaired 2 decades earlier. The posts were silvered with age, but solid. Billy kicked one with his boot. "Still good work," he said. Weber smiled. "Still Texas soil," he replied. Inside the farmhouse, Martha Gibson, now white-haired and fragile, sat in a rocker by the window. When she saw the visitor, her hands went to her mouth. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "Karl Weber." He knelt beside her chair and placed the Bible on her lap. "You gave me this," he said softly. "It kept me company for 20 years. Tears welled in her eyes. I always hoped you'd come back safe." She insisted he stay for supper. The table looked much as it had in 1944. Pie cooling by the window, the smell of coffee, the soft hum of cicadas outside. This time, though, the conversation had no translation gap. They spoke easily, mixing English and German like two melodies that had learned to harmonize. When grace was said, Martha added, "For the strange miracle that lets enemies sit as friends." Weber's visit sparked something larger. Newspapers picked up the story. Former POWs returned to Texas to thank their hosts. More followed. Men who had once labored in cotton fields or repaired barns began writing letters to their former employers, asking if they might visit. By 1967, reunions were being held at former campsites from Louisiana to Arizona. The events were modest: picnic tables, faded photos, and more hugs than words. But they carried the quiet gravity of history made whole. At one such gathering, an American guard named Lee McCullough stood beside his old prisoners and said, "We all came here young and angry. I think we left a little wiser," Weber answered in careful English, "and less afraid." On his last day in Texas, Weber visited the old campsite. The area was now a field of wildflowers and tall grass. He found the spot where his friend Friedrich Meissner had been buried. The original wooden cross was gone, but the soil still bore its imprint, a slight hollow in the earth, like a breath held too long. He knelt, placed a small metal cross there, and pressed his palm to the ground. "Rest easy, my friend," he whispered. "They remembered you." A gust of wind rolled through the grass, rustling like applause. When he rose, he noticed something new: a sign posted by the local historical society. Site of Camp Hearn, 1943–1946. Here stood a place where mercy was practiced in wartime. May we never forget. Before he left, a reporter asked Weber what he would tell younger generations about his time in Texas. He thought for a long moment and said, "Tell them that fences can hold men, but kindness can set them free. And tell them I saw a better Germany in the heart of America." The photograph from that interview became famous. Karl Weber, standing in a field of bluebonnets, the windmill spinning behind him, a Bible in his hands. The caption read, "The Fence Builder Returns." In the years that followed, Texas schools invited former POWs to speak to students. Their stories taught a different kind of history, one where victory wasn't measured in territory, but in character. Weber's visit helped launch the first local museum exhibit about the POW era. Artifacts appeared: hand-carved toys, letters, photographs, canteens etched with the names of both nations. On the wall hung a quote from a former guard: "They taught us that compassion is the strongest form of discipline." When Weber flew home, Billy Gibson drove him to the airport. They stood on the tarmac a moment, unsure how to say farewell. Billy extended his hand, then pulled him into an embrace. "My dad always said the Lord sent you here for a reason," he said. Weber smiled through tears. "Maybe to learn that good men wear many uniforms." As the plane rose into the sunset, the land below looked endless again. The same fields where mercy had once broken the cycle of hate. And for those who remembered, Texas would forever be more than a place on a map. It was proof that peace is not declared, it is practiced. By the 1970s, the Second World War had moved from living memory to textbooks. But for a scattered handful of Americans and Germans, it remained a heartbeat, steady, insistent, unforgotten. The fences were gone, the uniforms folded into museums, yet what endured was something far less visible: a shared moral vocabulary born from mercy. The story of the German POWs in America was never one of grand gestures. It was built on small, repeatable acts: bread passed across a table, a guard choosing patience over anger, a farmer trusting his former enemy with a plow. Those gestures multiplied quietly across the continent until they formed a new pattern of behavior, an instinct toward decency, even in victory. When historians trace the psychological recovery of post-war Germany, they often point to the Marshall Plan or the Berlin Airlift, but sociologists now acknowledge another factor: the thousands of ex-POWs who returned from American camps carrying first-hand lessons in fairness. They had seen an authority that corrected without cruelty, that fed even the defeated. Back home, those men became mayors, engineers, teachers. They rebuilt bombed towns with civic councils modeled on what they'd witnessed in the camps. committees that debated openly, voted honestly, and argued without fear. In Bremen, Karl Weber helped found a cooperative farm. He named it Friedensfeld, the Field of Peace. Its first harvest plaque read simply, "Built by men once enemies, tended by men now free." Children grew up hearing not only about battles but about fences mended and kindness repaid. And when those children came of age, they shaped a West Germany that defined itself not by conquest, but by conscience. The POW program also left fingerprints on American soil. In the 1950s and 60s, as the United States wrestled with segregation and civil rights, church leaders and educators often invoked the wartime camps as proof that dignity could transcend prejudice. One Texas pastor, who had served as a chaplain at Camp Hearn, told his congregation, "If we could show mercy to enemies in war, we can surely show justice to neighbors in peace." His words traveled far beyond the pulpit. Civic groups adopted the story of the POW farms as moral parables in local schools. By the 1970s, history teachers in Texas and Oklahoma were telling students not only how wars were fought, but how humanity had survived them. The lesson was subtle but enduring, that the strength of a nation isn't measured by what it destroys, but by what it refuses to destroy, even when it could. Half a century later, when new conflicts emerged in Korea, Vietnam, and the Middle East, U.S. military handbooks on POW treatment still quoted the precedents set in World War II. The Geneva Conventions were not abstract ideals. They had been field-tested on the farms of Texas and in the mess halls of Georgia. Officers who had once guarded German prisoners became instructors at West Point, teaching young cadets that discipline without compassion breeds only obedience, not peace. Their cadets would carry that principle into future wars, often imperfectly, but never entirely forgotten. By the 1980s, the generation that had lived the war began passing their memories to children and grandchildren. Family albums in both countries told the same improbable tale. A German father showing a faded photograph of an American farm, an American grandmother keeping a wooden toy carved by one of the German boys. In Topeka, Kansas, the Reynolds family still displayed a spoon engraved with the initials HT for Hiroshi Tanaka, a Japanese POW who had shared meals with Sergeant Joseph Reynolds. In Texas, the Gibsons kept Karl Weber's letters framed above the mantel. Their grandchildren read them aloud at school presentations titled "When Mercy Won." For those descendants, war was no longer a distant abstraction. It was a test their ancestors had faced and, somehow, passed. By the late 1980s, television crews began producing documentaries about the POW era. One series, Enemies No More, aired interviews with surviving prisoners and guards. Viewers around the world watched elderly men, once trained to kill each other, embrace on camera. Their words were simple, their accents thick, their eyes wet. Karl Weber appeared briefly in one episode. Asked what he had learned from his time in Texas, he smiled faintly and said, "That forgiveness is not given. It is demonstrated." The broadcast reached millions. Letters poured into the network from veterans, students, and teachers thanking the filmmakers for showing that courage could look like compassion. By the turn of the century, military historians began using a new term for the moral aftermath of World War II. 2. Ethical patriotism. It described the pride a nation feels not in its firepower, but in its restraint. And at the heart of that idea lay stories like the POWs in Texas. In museums from Berlin to Washington, exhibits on the war began including these accounts. Photos of prisoners harvesting crops, letters thanking guards for kindness, even the blueprints of camp libraries stocked with donated English books. Visitors stood silently before captions that read, "When victory met mercy, civilization advanced. Decades later, Weber's granddaughter visited Texas herself. She stood where the camp once stood, the wind moving through wild grass and bluebonnets. Local schoolchildren were there on a field trip. When the teacher explained that enemy soldiers once lived here, a boy raised his hand and asked, "Were they bad guys?" Weber's granddaughter knelt beside him and answered softly, "They were hungry men who met kind people. That's what made them good again." The boy nodded, as if the math of history had suddenly made sense. That moment, brief and quiet, was the true inheritance, the transfer of empathy from one generation to the next. Every war leaves ruins, but a few leave lessons sturdy enough to rebuild from. The German POWs who once feared the noose found themselves fed, housed, and, most shockingly, respected. Their captors, in turn, discovered that mercy could be stronger than vengeance. That equation became one of the few victories of the 20th century that didn't need to be refought, as historian Dr. Eleanor Grant wrote in 1995, "The fences of Texas were history's quiet classroom. In them, two nations learned the same lesson, that humanity, once practiced, can never fully be unlearned." Today, the old campgrounds bloom each spring. Children ride bicycles where guard towers once stood. Cows graze where prisoners once marched. And when the wind shifts just right, locals say they can still hear faint voices in German. Laughter carried across 7 decades of peace. The narrator's voice lowers to a final thought. In the end, history is not remembered for who won or lost, but for who remained human. On a Texas ranch, in the heat of war, strangers proved that mercy is not weakness. It is civilization's strongest weapon and its lasting inheritance. The war ended more than 70 years ago, but some stories never signed an armistice. They live on, not in headlines or textbooks, but in the quiet spaces between generations. A rusted spoon, a folded letter, a photograph of men once divided by flags, now standing side by side under the same Texas sky. History often remembers what was destroyed, but perhaps its truest measure is what was preserved. Compassion, decency, the fragile courage to choose mercy over pride. The story of the German prisoners on American soil is one such measure. It began with barbed wire and ended with handshakes. And in that unlikely arc, humanity rediscovered itself. The fields where the camps once stood have long since been reclaimed by grass and cattle. The watchtowers are gone, the guard barracks dismantled. Only the foundations remain, slabs of concrete half swallowed by the soil. But if you stand there at sunset, when the wind moves through the grass like an old hymn, you can almost hear it. The distant rhythm of boots on gravel, the clatter of tin trays, the faint strains of laughter that no one expected to hear. It's easy to forget that mercy once lived here. But the land hasn't. Texas remembers. Every spring, blue bonnets bloom across those forgotten acres, blue as twilight, bright as hope. Locals say they sprout strongest where the camp kitchen once stood, as if the earth itself honors what was fed there. Not just hunger, but humanity. Karl Weber's story is no longer just his own. It belongs to every man and woman who ever learned that forgiveness can travel farther than fear. He died in Bremen in 1991 at the age of 79. Among his papers was a single photograph, faded, creased, but carefully preserved. It showed 3 men in work clothes standing by a fence: Weber, the rancher John Gibson, and a young American guard named Lee McCullough. Scrawled on the back were 4 words in both English and German: "No enemies, only men." That photograph now hangs in the Camp Hearn Museum, beside a display of POW crafts and handwritten letters. Visitors pause there longer than anywhere else. Some leave quietly in tears. Others smile as if they've just remembered something they didn't realize they'd forgotten. that even in war, kindness is still possible. Across decades and continents, the lesson of those camps has rippled outward. It's found in military academies that teach honor through restraint, in classrooms where children learn that compassion is not weakness, but wisdom, and in the hearts of families who pass down stories of how their grandfathers once fed the enemy and called him friend. Historians call it an anomaly, a humane captivity in an inhumane war. But perhaps it was something simpler, a glimpse of what peace looks like before anyone dares to name it. Because peace, like mercy, begins quietly, with one man choosing to see another not as a threat, but as a reflection, with one guard offering water, with one prisoner offering respect in return. Those choices did not win the war. They won something rarer, the right to look back and still recognize oneself as human. In the great machinery of war, mercy is often forgotten. It does not roar like engines or thunder like artillery. It whispers, in kitchens, in handshakes, in letters home. But it endures long after the guns fall silent. Here, on these Texas plains, the sons of two nations met as enemies and parted as men. And though time has buried their camps, it has not buried their example. They came expecting chains. They found compassion instead. They built fences and barns. But what they truly built was trust. For every battle the world remembers, there are moments like this the world forgets, when mercy became a form of resistance, and kindness, the quiet aftermath of war. History records nations by their victories. Humanity remembers them by their virtues. The story of the German POWs in Texas is not about who won. It is about who refused to lose their humanity.